Inflation remains at the forefront of market concerns in Asia. Most Asian central banks have already started hiking rates. So why is Sri Lanka's case different, and for how much longer can its monetary policy stay as loose as it is? Anushan Selvaraja investigates.
Welcome to this week's edition of The Voice of Business. I have with me Samantha Amarasinghe, economist at Standard Chartered Bank and an LMD columnist. Now, Samantha, your column in the May edition of LMD, which releases next week, that you say that there is a, quote, a possibility that inflation might breach the central bank's expectations, unquote, and that your forecast for 2011 has been raised to 7.4% from 6.5%. Could you elaborate on this and tell us what sensitivities there are?
Sure. The March inflation data and the expectation that inflation will rise further in April, our estimate is for inflation to rise to 9.1% year on year, has prompted us to raise our full year inflation forecast to 7.4% from 6.5%. The central bank's view is that they will be able to maintain inflation at 7% levels. We expect inflation to increase before moderating in the second half of the year for three reasons. The first one being signs of demand-driven inflation, as we've seen private sector credit demand expanding by 29.7% in the month of February year on year. This was, albeit off a low base. However, we are seeing a trend in credit growth. The second factor is persistently high and volatile crude oil prices. And the third, the central bank's continued absorption of foreign exchange inflows with a view to preventing excessive Sri Lankan rupee appreciation, which has been largely responsible for the excess liquidity in the banking system.
Now, Standard Chartered Bank's expectations of a hike in interest rates in the fourth quarter of this year has been brought forward by a quarter. This despite the central bank's apparent stance that the status quo will remain. How come?
Well, subsequent to this article, at its April policy meeting, the central bank, although maintaining the status quo on policy rates, raised the statutory reserve ratio by 1 percentage point to 8% from 7% to tighten liquidity. It's a move that clearly signals an exit from its accommodative monetary policy stance and highlights its concern, in line with the IMF's directive, that excess liquidity in the system may fuel inflation or higher inflation if left unchecked. We expect monetary tightening to be gradual, as the central bank will attempt to control any build-up of demand-side pressure through liquidity management first, before resorting to rate hikes to curb inflation. Due to the risks I highlighted earlier, we have factored in cumulative rate hikes of 50 basis points by end 2011, a 25 basis points hike in Q3 and also one in Q4.
Now, you cover what's happening in the region, especially with regard to monetary policy in your LMD commentary. Could you expand on this and explain why Sri Lanka is, as you say, the odd one out?
Inflation remains at the forefront of market concerns in Asia. Most Asian central banks have already started hiking rates. Sri Lanka's case seems different, and the inflation growth dilemma facing the government is largely responsible for this. There was a somewhat dichotomous relationship between inflation and rates for some time. We are seeing inflation rising in Sri Lanka, but the central bank, up until its April policy meeting, was reluctant to shift gears into policy tightening mode. So Sri Lanka appeared to be the odd one out in the region, not having hiked rates since February 2007, and the reason being growth remains the dominant theme. We are seeing now a shift in stance, with the central bank expressing concerns about demand-driven inflation and taking appropriate policy measures as reflected in the 1 percentage point SRR hike this month.
Samantha, the price of oil, as we know, has been spiraling upwards in recent weeks. Would you expect more of the same, and if so, for how long? And also, what impact will this have on our fiscal makeup?
Well, we expect Brent crude oil to trade in a US dollar $110 to $125 per barrel range. This has widened given recent market activity, and we expect it to trade in this range until the end of Q3 2011, averaging $115 per barrel over that period, and US dollars 111 for 2011, on the assumption that further actual supply outages are limited. We believe this will have limited impact on Sri Lanka's fiscal position unless oil prices breach the US dollar 150 barrel mark.
That was Samantha Amarasinghe speaking to Benchmark's Anushan Selvaraja. Thank you for watching our show. Enjoy the rest of Labor Day. We'll see you again next week.